For he that eats and drinks unworthily, in an unworthy manner, eateth and drinketh judgment or chastening to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. In other words, if you eat this way, you're going to get chastened. For this reason, many are weak and sick, and many sleep. They had had sickness, severe illness, and they had had death. Now, it isn't so much, I don't think, the idea that when anybody did this, God came down and supernaturally, miraculously killed him or gave him a supernatural illness. But what happens here is, in the Corinthian assembly, you have a whole bunch of people living in sinfulness. And sinfulness has physical ramifications. So that when the Apostle Paul in chapter 13 is saying to them, love each other, he is not simply saying this is a soul issue, he's saying this is a body issue as well. For the wholeness of your assembly, for the wholeness of your own body, for the wholeness of all of these things, you need to love. Now remember, and this is the key point that I want to use to tie the thing that I've just said with the things I'm going to say. Remember, all sin is a violation of love. All of it. All of it. So that he is simply saying, you are sinning. So you are sick spiritually. So you are sick physically. And here is the answer. Love, and all of these things will disappear. You say, well, John, what do you mean? Love will eliminate all sin. Look at Matthew chapter 22. Matthew 22, verse 34. When the Pharisees had heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they were gathered together. They were always trying to prove themselves better than the Sadducees. They figured if the Sadducees had got flattened by Jesus, they'd move in and flatten Jesus, and they'd gain a little of the upper hand in their society. So they came along, and they prompted one particular lawyer to ask Jesus a question. Master, which is the great commandment in the law? The most significant one. Of course, they had the idea that you had to keep the law to be saved, but they were smart enough to realize that that way nobody's going to get saved because nobody can keep the law. So they decided that, at least some of them did, that if you could just find one good law and keep that one law, you'd be all right. And so they were simply saying, which is that one law? And Jesus said, here it is, thou shalt, what's the next word? Love. And here we introduce to the concept of love in relation to this law. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And on these two commandments hang all the law and prophets. Now listen. If you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, if you love your neighbor properly as yourself, you will never sin because you will do nothing to violate God. You will do nothing to violate your neighbor. That takes care of it. Love then fulfills it all. In Romans chapter 13, a familiar word in verse 8, he says, love one another. He that loves another has fulfilled the law. That says, thou shalt not commit adultery, not kill, not steal, not bear false witness, not covet. And if there's any other commandment, it can be briefly comprehended in this one saying, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Love works no ill to its neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. You don't need a commandment that says, thou shalt not kill your neighbor if you love your neighbor. You don't need a commandment that says, don't covet if you love the person who possesses what you don't have. So you see, both of those passages say this. To simplify all of living, love God, love your neighbor. And you won't have to worry about anything else. 1 Timothy 1:5 is a verse we ought to remember. It says this, the end of the commandment. In other words, the reason, the objective, the sum of it all, the point of it all, the end of the commandment is love out of a pure heart. 1 Timothy 1:5. The end of the commandment is love out of a pure heart. God is trying to get us to love. 1 Corinthians 16:14 says this, let all your things be done with love. Let all your things be done with love. Proper theology is no substitute for love. Activism and service is no substitute for love. Selective affection, that is, attraction to certain people, is no substitute for a widespread love. Immaturity, ignorance is no substitute, and it is no excuse for love. 1 Thessalonians 4:9 says you don't need to be taught of love because God has taught you how to love. Romans 5:5 says He's put His love in your heart. God wants Christians to be happy. God wants Christians to be healthy in their soul. God wants you to know what it is to be blessed and not feel His chastening, even in the area of physical illness that comes about because of the trauma of willful sin. And the real key to all of it is to learn to love. This is the indispensable reality for the Christian. God is love. And if God is to be seen in us, it is going to be when we are love as well. Now, it is so important that we love that the New Testament just keeps hammering away at it. For example, Colossians 3:14 says, put on love. 1 Corinthians 14:1 says, follow after love. Philippians 1:9 says, abound in love. Hebrews 13:1 says, continue in love. 1 Thessalonians 3:12 says, increase in love. 1 Peter 4:8 says, be fervent in love. Philippians 2:2 says, be consistent in love. Hebrews 10:24 says, provoke each other to love. 2 Corinthians 8:8 says, be sincere in love. And on it goes. This has always been the pinnacle of life. It's the pinnacle of wholeness for the Christian. And the healthy, happy, positive, glowing, useful Christian is the one who loves. You say, well, that's great, John, but how does it work? How does love function? Well, look at these verses again, 1 Corinthians 13:4-7, and we'll see. I've tried to say all along, love is not an emotion, and I hope you're getting that. The first 3 verses, we discussed the prominence of love. Verses 4-7, the perfections of love. Now remember the first 11 that describe love? Now comes the crescendo in verse 7. Look at it. These are the final 4 elements of love, and it's just kind of like Paul is really flying by now as he gives these, and they really kind of gather up some of the others as well as he peaks out in a crescendo of definition of love. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And then he caps it off by saying, love never fails. Now let's look at these 4 in verse 7. They're hyperbole. That is, they are statements of exaggeration. Love bears all things, all things, all things, all things, 4 times. We have to understand that when he says all things, he doesn't mean all things in a universal sense. Love certainly has to make some discrimination. We have to try the spirits to see whether they're of God. And we don't believe the devil, do we? Doesn't mean all things in the general, total, universal sense. What it means is all things within the limitations of proper biblical boundaries, proper Christian discrimination.